Oh, the song of our people, man. Yes. All right. Well, good morning again, and welcome out. We've had a few more people join us, so I feel like maybe there's an announcement or two that I should reiterate. Next week, just before we launch into things, next week we have no kids services. So that means just either I'm having a stroke or it just got really dark up here. So there it is. So if your kids are across the street, then just hey, bring them with you next week. So obviously we'll have nursery still available, but we're going to do family style worship next week, and then I think that was kind of the main one that I wanted to reiterate. And we're doing communion next week as well. So yeah. Well, today we are concluding our 4-week series over work. Here goes again. Very interesting. Yeah, we're concluding our 4-week series over work. And so just to kind of quickly recap where we've been over these 4 weeks, so the previous 3 weeks, is week 1 and week 2, we really looked at these fundamental like theological truths about work, right? That you were created for work. Like always and forever. This has always been sort of the idea, like there was never a point in our past or a point in our future where God says, "Will you just stop working," right? Like even in the Garden of Eden, there was work, and even in God's new creation reality, there's going to be work. There's things for us to do, and in the space between, you guessed it, there's work, right? And we said that that's actually big and countercultural for a lot of reasons. We really explored that, man. I encourage you to go back and check that out if you didn't catch that service with us. We also said that our like not only is work a good thing, not only is it something that we're supposed to engage in, but man, our work has purpose. It has meaning. It has dignity. No matter what you do, because your work its value isn't based off of what you do, but off of who you work for and whose image you display to the world through your work. Right? We also said that, and we said that everyone is a full-time vocational minister in that regard. That I'm no more a full-time vocational minister than any of you are. That our work is also this thing that's meant to be worked out over the theater of redemption. That just like Jesus' work, our work is supposed to take this world and take it somewhere good, right? That God's work, Jesus' work, was a work of redemption, and we're supposed to mirror that through our work. And then, so that capped off week 1. Week 2, we then went in and explored all the reasons why work is terrible sometimes, right? And I asked a few questions about that, and it's like, is work ever bad? And we said, yes, absolutely. So we went back and we sort of looked at this theological truth behind why work is so broken and so messed up, right? And then week 3, this was the last week, what we did was we took all of those sort of pillars of work that we called them, those theological truths about work, we meshed them together, and we came away with this new vision for work. Like, what is our work actually supposed to accomplish, and how do we begin going about that, right? And I said, man, there's this verse in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 10, when it says that when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. And we took it really slow. I mean, like really slow. We cut apart every single word in that sentence. And what does like righteousness mean? What does it mean to prosper? And how does our prosperity lead to a city rejoicing and ultimately to the glory of God? And we took our time going through that because that's our purpose. That's what work is supposed to do and what it's supposed to lead to. And again, I don't have time to go all the way through that again, but I encourage you, if you missed it, to go back and check that out, man, because it's sort of the big like crescendo of the whole series. If you miss that, then you miss everything that we were building to. But this week, we're going a completely different direction. In fact, the exact opposite direction. Because you can't talk about work and you can't have a good theology of work without a good theology of rest, right? And here's the deal. Work without rest inevitably leads. It leads to slavery, idolatry, and the destruction of the very thing that we're working for. Right? This is like, that's no small claim, and I realize that, but that's really what I hope to sort of impress on you this morning, is that work, like without rest and without like good, appropriate, God-honoring rest, it inevitably leads to all of those things. We got enough history, and you probably have enough of your own personal history to say that, like, man, have you ever felt like a slave to your job before? Have you ever worked so much that, like, at the end of the day, it's like you're so tired and you're so worn out that no matter how much more effort you pour into it, it seems like you're only doing damage to, and like you can never like really keep up with all that needs to be done. And here's the deal. I just want to start this morning with a move of complete honesty with you. I am an abysmal failure at this. Really, I like no joke. I am a complete failure at this, and it is really hard to talk about something with conviction that you're not walking in faithfully yourself, right? And maybe many of you, like when I brought this up, maybe there's some of you that are like, you know what, I'm good at this, and there's a few of you that are like right where I am, and you know that you have a hard time like turning things off. Like people depend on you. Like people, they're like you're a part of some big things, maybe some world-changing things. Whatever the case is, like if you don't show up good and ready to work, like at your best, like not only is like people, your finances, your family at stake, but maybe like for some of you guys in the military, like maybe the lives of other people could be at stake, right? So like this isn't something that you can just lightly turn off. But how do you turn it off, and how do you rest well, right? And I would say that I am a failure at this. And so for that reason, I wanted to tell you, I want to talk about like authority and truth for just a second, right? I don't come at you with this subject from like some moral high ground this morning. In fact, I never do. Like, and if you go somewhere and that's the authority that people appeal to is their own moral high ground over an issue, like you need to run, because that's actually not a good thing at all, right? Actually, I want to appeal to the Bible and allow it to define rest for us. Because anytime that I like struggle with something, anytime that I like have this issue, and it's like I know I'm not good at rest, right? What I do is I go in and I take what's known as a systematic approach. And that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to take a systematic approach to really uncovering what does the Bible have to say about rest. And we're just going to let that definition sort of evolve over the course of this morning. This is why we're going at it the way we are. We're going to let rest. We're going to look at its very first mention in the Bible, and we're going to track its progression and its evolution as it grows into this big, huge like concept in the Bible. And we're going to watch it grow and what that has to do with us, right? And so just to let you know, I'm sitting in the seats with you this morning because I'm terrible at this, right? And I need it. Like I need to rest well. And just to let you know how like bad it is. Danielle, if we're gonna rest and we're gonna like unplug, she typically has to book something like at least a couple of hours away for us, right? Like, or else like I'll be on my phone, or I'll be making phone calls, or whatever the case, be working on my computer or something like that. And so typically if I'm going to rest well, it means that Danielle like steps in, and I'm so thankful that I have her for a lifeline in that she's just like, nope, we're unplugging and we're going away for a couple of days. And so maybe you have somebody in your life that does that, and if you do, then man, like just turn to them and thank them for that right now. So, all right, so we're going to start at the very first instance of rest in the Bible that we see it, and we're going to watch it evolve. We're going to see what it has to do with us this morning. But before we do that, we have to have a conversation about the number 7. So if you're taking notes, this is really important. You're going to see this multiple times today. And I'm not going to have really time to go back and reiterate the importance of it, but nope, there they are. I'm not going to have time to go back and reiterate the importance of this, but I just need you to kind of lock this away in your brain, that the number 7, right, in the Bible, the number 7 denotes completeness, fullness, and like perfection, right? Completeness, fullness, and perfection. I've heard it said that 7 is like God's number. In that, like God is complete, He's full, and He is perfect in His own right? And so, number 7, you're going to see this crop up over and over and over again in the Bible, like today specifically. Just need you to lock that away. It's going to be important, right, to sort of our understanding. You guys good with that? Everybody good? Ready to launch into this? All right, here we go. Genesis chapter 1, if you have your Bibles, turn there with me. Genesis chapter 1, we're going to go to the very last verse of that chapter. Genesis 1, verse 31. Here it is. God saw all that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. So we'll talk about this because we see something that has been a pattern up to this point. So if you've read the creation narrative, which actually we've read it a few times just over the last couple months as we've been in our last few series, we've talked a lot about this. But there's a pattern in this that is really important to understanding what happened and what was different on day 7. And the pattern goes typically like this. God creates something. God creates, the heavens and the earth, and He creates light. And then there was evening, and it was good. He calls it good. And then there was evening, and there was morning, the blank day, whatever day that was, day 1, right? God creates the fish and the birds, and God saw that it was good, and it was evening, and it was morning, the blank day. God creates the beasts of the field, all of mankind, and he saw that it was very good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day, right? This was what we read, right? And this is incredibly important because the very next thing we read doesn't sound anything like that, and yet the author has went through a lot of trouble to follow this pattern, which is telling us some things, up to this point. Day 1, day 2, day 3, 4, 5, 6. All of these days, they follow the same pattern, right? And then chapter 2, very next chapter, verses 1 through 4 is the last day. We see this, right? And here's the deal. If you didn't know this, like we added the verses and the chapters later in the Bible, right? And so don't let that fool you because we've moved into a new chapter. This is all still one continuous thought, like given by the author. Like we're the people, just it makes it easier for me to say, hey, turn to chapter 2, verse whatever, right? But this is all one continuous thought. Here's what it says. Thus, the heavens and the earth were completed. In 6 days, they were completed in all their hosts. Man, this thing is driving me nuts. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. All right, so God, he makes in 6 days. Day 7, he is completely finished, right? It's fullness, it's completeness, it's perfection, right? It's that whole number 7 thing, right? Then God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it. Anybody have a different word in their translation than sanctified it? You have anything different there? Made it holy? I love that. Okay, so if you have your Bibles and you or people who write in your Bible, then circle that, underline that. It's going to be a really big deal here in a little bit, all right? Because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, right? This is the seventh day, and on this day, God's work of creation is brought to its completion, its fullness. It is perfect, and everything is as it should be, but did you notice what was missing on day 7? Right? It was the pattern. God didn't create anything on day 7, but more notably, he doesn't call it good or evil. There isn't any evening and there isn't any morning, right? It's day 7, but the marker of time, which is what that is, that lets us know, okay, there's a complete section of time here. There's evening and there was morning. Boom, break, we're starting something new. There's evening and there's morning, break, we're starting something. That doesn't exist on day 7. Day 7 is like the day without end, right? See, for God, there is perfect rest from his work for forever. This is called God's rest. This is going to be a huge, huge deal as we watch this evolve. And here's the deal. This verse has about 1,000 different implications, right? Like you're going to see it as we go on in the text, and we'll watch this sort of evolve today. This verse has about 1,000 different implications, and so I'm not going to actually spend a whole lot of time on it because basically anything in the Bible that talks about rest, any of the biblical authors after this point, is they make some point about rest, or they further the idea of rest in the Bible, and they say this is what rest means, and this is how we do rest, or whatever. You know what they do? They all point back to this place right here. It's rooted in God's rest. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time other than just to say that just as we were created for work, we were also created to balance our work with rest. Right? We've seen up to this point, we've looked at this every single week during this series, that we were created in the image of God. And if you just had Genesis chapter 1, right, to go from, we didn't have any of the rest of the Bible, and God makes mankind in his image, then what are we? We're creators. We're rulers. We're sustainers, right? We're gardeners, actually, was the very first image that we sort of get of who we are. And then it takes it a step further, and beyond our image, we see a little bit more of God's character evolve, and immediately we see that not only were we created to be workers, creators, but we're also created for this rest. And it's for this rest that we were meant to live in perfectly, right? A note about that word rest we see here in this verse. You guys ready to go back to Hebrew school for just a second? The word rest is Shabbat, S-H-A-B-B-A-T. It just literally means to stop. So the idea is this, that God didn't kick his feet up in the recliner because he was tired on day 7. God didn't like have to exert himself in creation. I mean, he just spoke a word and creation came into existence. It wasn't hard for God to do this. He didn't need to rest because he was tired. God stopped because his work was completed, right? Number 7, it's fullness. It's brought to completion and perfection, and there was nothing else needed except for God to like stop, to rest back, right? And so this is like the very first occurrence of our word rest, and it's Shabbat, and it just means to stop. And so I'm going to say that a lot today. I'm going to say that we Shabbat, we stop. And later on, we're going to see a transliteration of that word called, anybody want to take a guess? Sabbath. We'll see this. This is going to be a big deal for our rest, right? Here's the problem for us, though, as a created thing. And if you live in this world and you know this to be true, is that as good as your rest may be, and in those moments where you may actually experience some real rest, guess what? There's evening, and there's morning, and then boom, back to work on Monday. Anybody been there? Yeah. It's like we kids had a long weekend this weekend, and we went camping. We went to this place called Elk Camp at the base of Mount Rainier. Fall colors were beautiful and stuff, and it's just like, man, you get into a space like this, and it's like you really enjoy it, and it's just like somebody hits, forward times 1.5 on the speed button of life. Anybody, it's like, dude, time isn't supposed to move this fast when we get there. And it's just like, before you know it, it's like we're already, anybody have that proverbial like halfway point in their vacation where it's like, dude, we just crossed the threshold and it's just like all downhill from here? Anybody have that in their mind? Dude, I think about it every time. I'm like calculating it on our way somewhere, and I'm like, dude, that means like Thursday night at like 7:30 is going to be the midpoint. And it's like, and I just watch it, and then time just like speeds on through, right? And it's just like, for us, man, it's like there's always evening, there's always morning, there's always day 8, right? There's a day 1 begins again, and we clock in again, and it's the same nonsense over and over again. And it's like, man, so seriously, while God rested from his work, that maybe a key difference for us to take away from this passage is that we rest for our work. And that may sound like semantics, but that actually changes a lot of the way that we deal and we think about our work, right? That man, you were created for rest. And like, maybe that's one of those statements, again, that you sort of expected to hear at a church service on a Sunday, but let's just take stock of how absolutely countercultural that is in the world that we live in, right? Stay-at-home moms, stay-at-home dads, right? Is there ever a moment where you feel like I'm off the clock? Any of you guys, you got something worked out there where it's like I feel like I'm off the clock at a certain time of day or whatever the case is, and it's like in the second you think that it's after the kids go to bed, one of them will puke in their sheets, and then they come in and you got to like deal with the kids or something like that, and it's like you love your kids and you love the work that you do with this, but you realize that if this is your job, that it's like a full-time job. Or like, man, I think about this one, rank in the military. Did you know that you actually get paid way less the more rank that you get made? Anybody who's made it a little while in the military like totally realizes this, because like when I was like in E1, E2, it's like when I was done with work, bro, I was done. Like I went home, I didn't think about it anymore. It's like I see some guys shaking their heads, but what happens, man? You put on a few stripes or you put on that second set of bars up there, and it's like all of a sudden now that phone never stops ringing. You got people getting DUIs on Christmas break. Man, this was 2 years ago. I had a troop. Underage, drank, left the base, and then came back on the base, and you can guess how that went. And so it's like, dude, we're heading on Christmas vacation with the family, and it's like, I'm still not off work. I'm still like, we're literally on the road, like trying to figure out if she just needs to drop me off at base so I can just go to work and they can like go on a vacation or something, right? It's like, this. It's like the more rank, the more responsibility you take on, the less time off that you actually have. And this is sort of how our world works, right? This is the culture. And here's the idea, man. Do you know what margins are? I think we have, like, our title slide has a piece of paper, and that was really purposeful. And it was really for this moment right here. Margins are those little red lines on the side of your piece of paper that denote where work stops, right? Like anything in between these two lines, and I'm left-handed and was like had really bad handwriting in like grade school, and so I would constantly go past the margins. And I had some teachers that were like, dude, they were super super strict about the margin thing, man. If you like bled over into the margins a little bit, it's like, dude, you're getting points counted off for every letter that you had over the margins. And it's like, dude, there's something to that. like that there's a space that between these two lines of Monday to Friday or whatever the case, between these two lines, it's like, dude, you are good. Fill it with work. In fact, God created you and meant for you to take this. He handed us this world as like this blank piece of paper, but it had margins on it. And he says, man, in between these margins, I want you to fill it. Go to baseball games. Work hard, work long hours, like do whatever it is that you do, but here in these margins, there's these side things, and it's like, dude, these are sacred, these are set apart, you don't feel these. You were created to have these margins, and yet everything in our culture is pushing us towards normalizing and evaporating those margins. Man, we do more with less. That was a big thing in the military. They started like paring stuff down. And I was like, dude, every meeting, every little thing we went to, it was like, man, you just got to figure out how to do more with less. And it's like, you guys are, and then the bigwigs would get up there and they would champion us as these saviors because it's like, and you guys do so much more with so much less. You guys know what I'm talking about in this. And it's just like, man, our kids even. Right? It's like we expect more of our children than we ever have earlier in their life, man. It's like some of the stuff that Jack brings home from school, dude, I didn't see that stuff until I was like 10th grade, or maybe I just don't remember seeing it. But like some of that stuff, like I didn't see till I was like much. And we ask things. I think of like Running Start for our kids, and it's like that's awesome, and that's an incredible program, and that's really good things. And it's like, dude, we're asking kids. If you just think about this for a second, we're asking our children to like pick a career path when their gray matter isn't even fully formed yet, that's going to like potentially affect like what they do for the rest of their life. Like, dude, I went to like the medical, like pre-med Running Start. You see where I'm at now, man. It was 2 years of community college wasted when I was in high school, man. It was like that, and yet like this is sort of the cultural persuasion that we're just like, do more, quicker, earlier, like you guys, and this is our culture. And do we love to like fight about stuff? We love to champion causes and get behind things that seemingly matter, and we're countercultural, and we want, dude, like, can I just tell you something worth actually fighting for? It's rest, man. Dude, push back against this culture that says that you have to evaporate your margins to get ahead in life. As we're going to see, God says absolutely not. We want to take a stand for something culturally, man. Let's not sign up for 6 sports in the same season, right? Let's not involve our kids in things or ourselves in things and make commitments for things that like at the end of the day, and this is how I do it. It's because I have good intentions, right? Like, I don't fail at rest because, like, I just look at God's word and I say, yeah, I ain't doing that. It's not how I fail at rest. I fail at rest because I have a bunch of really good things that I want to commit myself to and I want to be a part of and I want to help and I want to serve. And then at the end of the day, it's God's like, dude, you didn't check your margins. You started scribbling all in those things, and it was like, softball here, taking, kids to piano here, doing this here, or like, hey, you're meeting up with so-and-so here. And it's like, dude, and all of a sudden there's writing all across this page beyond the margins that God has declared for me to like do nothing in, to rest in. We were created for rest, right? So that's number one. The reality is that God actually has an incredible purpose for our rest. That's the next step of the evolution that we see. It's not just that we're created for rest, but that God actually has a purpose for our rest. And that doesn't come for like a few thousand years later in the biblical timeline. Actually, we have a long period of time after God rests on the 7th day. We have a worldwide flood. We have a big giant Tower of Babel in the middle of the desert. We have Abraham's story and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And then we have 400 years of slavery in Israel, right? God's people get no rest there. And then there's these 10 plagues. God sends Moses in, and he comes in, he brings the people out of Israel, and he's walking them through the desert, right? He's Red Sea crossing, all that stuff before we get our next evolution in this idea of rest. So you realize this is like rest isn't mentioned like anymore. There's no more idea really around rest. It's evolved between God's rest And in this moment, when the Israelites have now come out of the land of Egypt, and there's like 2 million of them walking through the desert, and all of a sudden they look up, which seems like in the text, maybe for the very first time, and they're like, bro, what are we going to eat? There's like 2 million of us out here, right? And there's not a Waffle House anywhere around. Like, we can't do that. Thank you. All my Southern people laughed at that. So, like, we can't possibly, like, we will drain a river if we all drank from it, right? Like, this is a serious, serious problem. And in this problem, in this dynamic, God chooses to deliver what would become a 40-year object lesson around rest. And here it is, man. This is what happens. Then the Lord said, so they've been grumbling about not enough food. Where are we going to eat? We're going to starve to death. If we could just go back to Egypt, we would have all the food we ever wanted. And here's what God says, right? Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. And this is kind of supposed to stand in stark contrast in your mind to what God originally said to Adam as they were being kicked out of the garden, that you're gonna work for your bread. Your bread, if you eat bread, you're going to have to scratch and claw for every bit of it that you eat from the sweat of your brow. And yet, here in the wilderness, in the least place where you're going to be able to scratch out bread, God says, I'm going to rain it down from heaven for you. And tell the people they shall go out and gather a day's portion every day that I may test them. Underline, circle, whatever. Whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So God's about to test the Israelites for 40 years, right? And here's sort of the basis for the test. We're going to look a little bit further down, verses 16 through 30. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece. It's a little handheld size, like measuring cup, right? You should take an omer apiece according to the number of persons each of you has in his tent. So there's 4 of you. You take 4 omers, really simple, right? The sons of Israel did so. And some gathered much, and some little. When they measured it with an omer, he who had gathered much had no excess, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. Moses said to them, let no man leave any of it until the morning. Right? So this is simple. You go out, you pick up this bread, and you eat all of that bread that you need for today. No midnight snacks, none of that, right? You just you pick up enough bread, and it's going to be enough. And if they picked up a lot, they ate it. And if they picked up a little, they were still satisfied at the end of the day. But don't leave it until the end of the day. Don't leave it overnight, because it's going to get nasty, right? But they didn't listen to Moses, right? They left some part of it until the morning, and it bred worms and became foul. I like the King James. It stank, right? And Moses was angry with them. They gathered it morning by morning, every man as much as he should eat, but when the sun grew hot, it would melt. Now on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each person, right? When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, right, so they come and they talk to Moses, and they're like, but every other day of the week, if we gather too much, it's like got maggots and it stinks by the end of the day. And Moses like, no. Like, trust me, right? This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a what? Sabbath. Tomorrow is a stop. Tomorrow you're going to stop and you're going to observe something. A holy stop to the Lord. And on that day, right, you're going to bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over, put it aside to be kept until morning. Day 6 instructions are a little bit different. Same bread, everything else is the same. You gather it, just gather twice as much, enough for tomorrow, but something miraculous is going to happen on this day, right? So they put it aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it did not stink, right? There wasn't any maggots or worms in it. And Moses said, eat it today, for today is a stop rest to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. Right? So if you go out and you're looking for it and you didn't follow my instructions, guess what? You're going hungry, right? Because your neighbor, he only gathered enough for him and his family, and so you can't go ask somebody else, right? If you didn't gather enough, you didn't trust God, then like you don't have any food. But it came about, and do you think they passed the test? Absolutely not, right? It came about on the 7th day that some of the people, they didn't gather enough on the 6th day, and so I could just imagine them sort of like sheepishly opening their tent up and like, is there any bread out here, and like kind of looking around, and they didn't find anything. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? See, the Lord has given you a stop rest Therefore, he gives you bread for 2 days. On the 6th day, remain every man in his place, so let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people got the picture, and they rested on the 7th day. God is giving the Israelites a 40-year object lesson so that they can answer these 2 questions. And this is the basis, and this is the purpose of all of our rest. It's for us to answer these same 2 questions. Do you trust me? And who provides for you? It's funny, man. It's like I could just imagine the Israelites going out, and God's trying to get them to see, do you trust me? And like, yeah, we trust you. And they like bend down and gather an extra handful of the stuff, right? And they put it in there, and the next day it's like it gets stink and it's got maggots in it, and God's like, yep, you didn't trust me, And then like by the end of the week they've sort of gotten it, and then day 6 is like, do you trust me? Yeah, God, we trust you. And it's like, and they're like, we ain't taking any of that extra because like I just got the stink out of the tent from the last time, right? And it's like, God's like, no, you should have trusted me because guess what? It ain't coming tomorrow, and this would have been good for you. And they wouldn't do it. And like over and over and over again, for 40 years, they wandered through the wilderness, and every single day, every single meal, every 7th day was a moment to stop, right? And realign their hearts. And this is the purpose of our rest. The Sabbath rest, the stop rest, becomes a moment where we stop and realign our heart to understand who we trust and who ultimately provides for us. This is God's purpose for our rest. What's wild is that this object lesson, it continued until the moment they crossed the Jordan River. And guess what the Bible tells us? It stopped. Why is that? Because God had brought them into the land of provision that he had been promising for generations to God's people. And now they're going to live in cities they didn't establish, in houses they didn't build. They're going to eat food from gardens that they didn't plant and drink wine from vineyards that they didn't cultivate, that God is going to provide for them in a new way, but it's going to require a new faithfulness in that, do you trust me? I'm going to drive these people out before you. Like, do you trust me? Will you listen to me? And so there's a whole other set of tests that God puts them through, right? And some of it's like, hey, you don't get to carry any swords into this battle. And they're like, bro, that's crazy. We're going to fight people. And God's like, no, do you trust for me? Do you trust me? Do you trust that I will provide victory for you? And if you trust me and you walk in this trust and in this faithfulness to me, then I will provide for you in a way that you can't provide for yourself. And we need to be reminded of that. Actually, and here's what's really neat is God didn't want them to lose this idea of the Sabbath just because the bread stopped, just because he knew over time that they were going to forget the lessons of coming into the land, and so God extends this lesson. So yeah, now they have the Sabbath, but also they have a Sabbath year. Check this out, man. Leviticus 25, 2-6. This is another evolution in rest. It says, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. The land gets its own rest. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyards and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year, and the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a stop to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest after growth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for your food, right? Yourself and your male and female slaves and your hired men, your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you, right? The idea was you just let the land go. And you could go out and you could pick food from it if you wanted, right? But you can't cultivate, you can't plant things, you can't trim your grapevines or any of these things, right? And what's wild is, so 6 years, you plant, you do everything like normal. 7th year, you don't. You rest. You let the land have a rest. And then, check this out, man. Every 49th year, so every 7 sets of 7 years, there's this super Sabbath. They call it the year of Jubilee. It's called the year of the Lord's favor also. That's going to be really key. And man, there's too much to, there's a huge section that's way too big for us to read this morning. Everything from the 7th year applies, but beyond that, you cancel every debt. Right? You cancel all debts. So everybody goes out and buys a Mercedes on year 49 because year 50, debts are canceled, right? You free all slaves. You return any land back to its previous owners. So fall on hard times. You and your family don't have enough people to work your land, and so you sell part of your land to your neighbor. And at the end of the 49 years, like God isn't wanting some giant like these massive farms or these massive corporations. Or like God wants this return sort of to the people, the family, to be able to bless all of the families, right? And man, all of it. Like if you think about it for very long, you realize that this isn't going to work out very well for any economy that operates this way, right? Because like I said, dude, I thought it was hilarious when the stimulus money dropped. Everybody going to Walmart? They had TVs rigged up for miles, man. They had aisles of TVs because they knew what people were going to do. They had a fat $1,500 check or however much it was in their account. They were going to go buy a TV. It's funny. I think we actually bought a TV, but we actually needed one. So don't judge me. All right. But everybody's going to go out and they're going to act all crazy. They're going to do something. In the years leading up to this, you don't have to think about it very long to think dude, I know how money works and I know how people are bent. This system isn't going to work. Dude, do you trust me, God says? Who provides for you? Check this out. This is how the chapter ends about this section. But if you say, what are we going to eat in the 7th year? Right? This thing ain't going to work. If we don't sow or gather in our crops, what are we going to eat? Then I will so order my blessing for you in the 6th year that it will bring forth crops for 3 years. When you are sowing the 8th year, you can still eat old things from the crop, eating the old until the 9th year when its crops come in. Dude, y'all, here's the idea. The end of your 6th year, dude, there's going to be such an abundance from God that you're not even going to have to walk out into the field and eat the little shriveled up grapes that are growing on the vines that you haven't kept. You don't have to worry about that, because you're going to have enough. In fact, you're going to store 3 years worth. So you're going to be taken care of that 7th year. You're going to be taking care of the 8th year because, man, that's going to be a wild year, going back in and cultivating, beating back all the briars and thorns and things that have grown up in your fields and trying to make it productive. And if you're a gardener, you know that long-term plants like that, they take a little bit of time before they're going to produce. They're not going to produce year 8 like they would have if you'd have been tending them. In fact, they're not going to produce until year 9. But guess what? You still got food year 8. And year 9, when your crops come back in, you're still going to have a double portion of goods and food that year. You can quickly see how dude, the prosperity and the blessing that would just begin to compound and build on itself if people were faithful to this. God says, do you trust me? God says, who provides for you? And in this, what we often do, we say, man, God, you're not the one clocking in, right? You're not the one sweating it out for every dollar earned, right? God, I'm the one who worked for this job. I'm the one that's putting in the sweat equity for this job. God, where are you actually at in this process? Listen to me closely, man. To which God replies, even the breath in your lungs needed to cast that insult. Now, which is exactly what it is every time we evaporate our margins in order, to work instead of rest. Every time that we begin to lean on our own strength and we begin to see ourselves as the only one we can trust and the only one who actually provides for ourselves, man, that's an insult. Because even the breath in our lungs needed to cast that insult is constantly being put there and sustained by God. God says you would be a nothing, man. You wouldn't have breath in your lungs to go to work if it weren't for me. We're going to move through these next few rather quickly. The next evolution of the Sabbath or rest comes in the Big Ten. Everybody know what I mean by the Big Ten? I don't mean the football league, right? The Big Ten Commandments, right? No other gods, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, all that good stuff, right? So Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. It says, remember the Sabbath day, remember the stop day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall do labor and all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your sons or your daughter, your male, your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. Nobody, right? Like, here's this exhaustive list. Like, there's nobody, there's no, like, caveat to this. There isn't, like, somebody you can have squirreled away, like, doing work on this day. Like, everyone in your house rests on this day. For in 6 days, what does it do? It points back to what we started. The Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, that is all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and He made it holy. So let's just talk about holiness really quick. Holiness is not about morality, although we, I think, often try to make it about morality. Holiness is absolutely not about morality. Holiness is about being separate or set apart. Now, it can be about morality in so much that your morality is separate and set apart from maybe somebody else's morality or God's morality. God is holy, and therefore His morality is completely otherly and beyond our morality, right? So in that sense, it has to do with morality or goodness. But actually, holiness isn't about. Holiness is about otherness. It's the margin idea. That it's this completely separate area. It's this separate thing. Back in Genesis chapter 2, right? Verse 3, what does it say? God, He sanctified. My version said He sanctified it. And you've heard that maybe about the Christian life. And again, we think it's about becoming like more holy, and that's not the case. Sanctification is the act of setting something aside. It's the intentionality at which we specifically, we regularly, we intentionally set this thing aside so that it is different from and unstained by anything in the regular sort of cycle. And here's the idea that God is getting at in this commandment. The idea is that we must approach our rest with regularity and intentionality if we're going to do it well. Because like I explained at the beginning of this, I don't rest well. And it's really because I sort of just expect it to happen in my downtime, right? It's like, well, Friday afternoon I'll get done with work, and then like the next day is rest, and what happens on the next day? Well, we shove everything into that day that like we should have maybe been doing, or maybe that we shouldn't have committed to in the first place, into this thing, and then all of a sudden it just doesn't happen naturally. And it's because I don't have like this thing, like this hard stop, this hard like set apart holy day in my mind. It's like I don't approach it with intentionality, and so therefore I don't do it. God says, no, this is so important. I need you to constantly be realigning your heart, answering the question of who do you ultimately trust and who is it that ultimately provides for you. That those two questions are life. They are the difference between life and death, as we're about to see here in just a moment. And I need you to constantly be realigning your heart under those two questions, regularly, intentionally. And there are some really awesome ways that you guys are going to explore in your expedition groups about how to do that and how we can begin to set up some rhythms of rest, regular, intentional rest. And so I encourage you guys to dive into that conversation headlong in your expedition groups. I don't have time to go into it here. So the next evolution of work and rest comes in the book of Leviticus. Again, this is one of those sections where it covers multiple chapters and a lot of content, and so I'm gonna do my best to sort of kind of cram it all into just a few seconds, right? So I can give you where all this stuff is found. In fact, I've got a packet that if you want to know more about this stuff, because I'm completely fascinated by it, and so I printed off some stuff that I thought you might be fascinated by, but it won't hurt my feelings if you don't take one. So, it's these like intentional moments of feasting and celebration. God creates and He sets up this cycle of 7 different feasts and festivals throughout the year for His people. This is sort of the next evolution of rest. And so some of them are feasts. All of them are festivals. Not all the festivals are feasts, if that makes sense, right? And here they are. Just I don't think these are in your notes, but we also have the Sabbath, right? That's a every single week type thing. But then He gives us Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Booths. There's a couple other feasts that come a little bit later, but they're not really doing this, right? And here's the deal. They're all different. You do different things. They last different amounts of days. There are different purposes for all of them. There's different symbolisms that are sort of wrapped into all of these. But all of them, we're trying to accomplish the same thing in God's people. And here was the purpose for all of these feasts and festivals. It was to cause us to look backwards and draw strength as we trust God for what He has done, and to also draw strength as we look forward in hope of what God will do. So the feasts and festivals are broken down into 3 spring feasts and 4 fall feasts or festivals. I like fall festivals. So there are 4 fall festivals and 3 spring festivals. And so here's the first 3, the spring feasts were all completely fulfilled in Jesus' first coming. Jesus come is the embodiment of everything that this feast was pointing towards, right? And so we have that to look at. And so all of the 4 fall feasts are like there's still a future element that maybe Jesus came and fulfilled part of them, but there's still an element that is outstanding that is yet to be fulfilled in it. So I'll give you an example. So Passover. There was this moment Israelites had watched God do like 9 crazy plagues battling against the gods of Egypt, right? The 10th one comes and God says, this is the big one. And this is going to affect everybody. God's going to send His destroyer, this angel of death, to come in and to claim the lives of every firstborn everything in the land of Egypt. If you want to be saved, then here's what you do. You take this 1-year-old spotless lamb and you kill this lamb, and then you take its blood and you dip a hyssop branch. This is kind of a weed that was around there, and you dip it, and then you paint your door with it, which sounds really, really strange because you're gonna it's gonna pass over. This God's angel of death is gonna pass over your house if it sees this blood over your door. And the idea is do you trust me? Who's gonna provide for your salvation? Okay, if you trust me, then do this. Follow this to the letter, and salvation will come to your house, right? It's sort of the idea of this. And so Jesus, that was the back element, that was the back end of what had happened. Jesus fulfills this, man, perfectly. Jesus was killed on Passover. Like, it doesn't get any... He was actually killed at the exact time of the day of Passover when the Israelites were supposed to make their sacrifice of the lamb and all this stuff, and it's crazy, like parallel symbolism and stuff that's going on in this, and it's awesome. I highly encourage you. This is why I printed the thing off, to do a study of these festivals and feasts, right? And so Jesus actually, He eats this meal. It had become this meal that they stop every year, same time, to stop and look back at what God had done for them in the past as they looked forward to this future embodiment of God's salvation that would come to their people. And Jesus has this meal with His people, and He says, it's being fulfilled in me. I'm the lamb. I'm about to go die. And He did this. And so His people, it took on this new significance to them. So there's one that's already been. Here's one that hasn't been. The festival or the Feast of Booths. Festival of Tabernacles is another name for it. And so the idea of this actually sounds like a blast, and I think we should take up and start doing this one, is they would go, everybody would leave their house, and they would go into the wilderness, which was typically just in their backyard because everybody already lived kind of in the wilderness, and they would build these little booths, these little, I don't know, little shanty tents out of brushes, sticks and weeds and stuff, and they would cover it up, and your entire family would come, and everybody would hang out. So you got kids running around everywhere, moms and dads and grandparents and friends, and everybody would connect their booths together and make these little tent cities out of sticks and stuff. And that just sounds like a blast to me. And the idea was that you just partied pretty much all week. Dude, you ate, you drank, you sang, you danced, everyone just had a good time. The kids, there was parts for the kids to play and grandparents to play in the celebration, and there were prayers for friends and all these sort of things that had grown up in the middle of this and this symbolism. And the idea was that God sustained His people for 40 years in the wilderness, that He met their needs. And He marched them to the promised land. And so the festival ended. Actually, the biggest party was the after party, because on day 8, when the party ended, they walked back into the cities, and that was when the real party happened. They went crazy on the last day of this festival, because now they were symbolically in the promised land. They were looking back at what God had done in bringing His people. And there's still a future aspect of this. We still live in the wilderness in this current season. We are still waiting on God's kingdom to be realized fully, and there will be this day in which we look backwards at what God did for the Israelites, and we can trust and hope in His future faithfulness because of what He has done in the past. You guys sort of get the idea behind these. And so here's the deal. We should regularly and intentionally look backwards at all the places God has showed up and sustained us in the wilderness as we look forward in the hope of his coming kingdom. I know when we moved out here, I have to tell you the story sometime. It was just one God thing after another. God opened doors. God made connections between us and people that were just beyond. There's nothing that we could have worked out. God, like where he placed us, the church that he connected us with, the leadership community that he connected us with, the things that God had done, and just like over and over and over again, there was these moments where we were just like, oh, dude, is this going to work out? And then God would he would do something miraculously to open some door that was just crazy incredible to allow us to continue on this journey. So, it was funny. I had a lot of these moments, and Pastor Bobby over at our Ascending Church, when I was kind of on staff with those guys, he was like, dude, remember those. Write those things down, because there's going to have to be a moment when you're going to look back at those things. Man, I can tell you the truth. Especially starting a church in the middle of COVID, I've looked back over those things. God didn't do everything he has done to drown us out here. God didn't toss us in the water to drown us. God has been faithful. He's been good. He has moved. He's opened doors. He's made connections. And there's just this thing that's dude, I just trust that God's going to continue to do this if this is the trajectory and this is the direction that he has moved us in. And man, and even if that trajectory begins to change one day and things begin to look different for us, it's like, man, can I trust God to sustain and provide even in that? Yeah, absolutely. Because this journey isn't anything like I thought it was going to look like when we started years ago. And yet, man, do you trust me? And who provides for you? And continually looking back at the ways God has been faithful to show himself in those two questions has propelled us forward to do something that we would never have had the strength. Or I'm telling you, man, getting out of the military May 2020, are you kidding me, man? It's the most secure job in the world to do what is arguably the least secure job in the world, right? And this is in our economy, it's maybe the least secure job in the world. But as we answer that question of who we trust and who provides for us, it actually becomes really, really simple. Next, we see that rest isn't an option. Leviticus 26 tells us what happens if we don't rest. I can't read all that because we're running long on time. Here's what's going to happen if we don't rest. God says, I will scatter among the nations and will draw out a sword after you as your land becomes desolate and your cities become waste. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath rest all the days of the desolation while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it will observe the rest which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living in it. Listen to me really closely. God created you for rest. God also created you for work, and he created your work and how he created you to benefit the world and to take it somewhere. You are rulers, you're co-rulers, you're co-heirs over creation, meant to steward this good creation and to take it somewhere through. And that's what we've explored the last 3 weeks. That's the new vision for work that we're sort of operating off of, right? But what happens when we don't rest? Man, all of a sudden now, our work isn't blessed through our rest, right? And ultimately, what happens is if we don't rest, we answer those questions of who do you trust and who provides for you with ourselves. That's idolatry, right? Right? Because God's people failed to trust God in their provision, their hearts were carried away in idolatry as they trusted in the work of their own hands. This is where God is speaking to the Israelite people here, and they actually. We don't think that they ever had a Sabbath year. They definitely never had a Jubilee. In fact, we were reading a story, and I forget who it was, Hezekiah, 8-year-old king, finds the book of the law, and he goes back, and they had never even celebrated Passover since the time of the judges. And this is several hundred years in in Israel's future. And God sends them into exile. He sends them in to let the land rest, and it does. The land rests for 70 years, man, which equates to about 490 years of unrest, which is about how long we think that they didn't observe all of those things. Scholars are pretty certain that God was absolutely true and trustworthy to his word on this. Here's the deal. rest is not an option. In fact, the harder we work and try to provide and sustain for ourselves, the more we become convinced that we are the ones responsible for our prosperity, right? The more our work actually shrivels and dies on the vine. And there comes a part in that process, and please don't miss this. I don't make this like this isn't a threat or anything, but there comes a point in this process that if you are a child of God, and He will realign your heart as He extracts rest from you if you don't do it willingly. One final two, and we're going to end. They're going to be really quick. Jesus starts His ministry talking about rest. All the Gospels give a little bit of a different story. They all agree that Jesus was baptized, and then Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days. And then after that, they all sort of diverge in the story that they tell about how Jesus' public ministry started. But here's what the Gospel of Luke says. It says, and He began teaching in their synagogues, Jesus, and He was praised by all. And He came to Nazareth where He had been brought up. And as was His custom, He entered the synagogue on the Sabbath, and He stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to Him, and He opened the book and found the place where it is written. So Jesus, He goes in. This is pretty common practice. They just opened up a particular book, and somebody from the audience, they would read, and then somebody, one of the teachers, one of the Pharisees or the Sadducees, depending on where you're at, they would stand up and they would sort of give an explanation for what was being read. Jesus handles both of those perfectly here. And here's what He says. Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed. Don't miss this. And to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. That with Jesus begins this jubilee. So He shuts it, right? He hands the book back to the attendant, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on Him. And He began to say to them, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. God's rest is that seventh-day rest that has no end. This is the rest that we were intended to enjoy from the beginning, but that we broke. And Jesus is claiming that He is now restoring through His life, ministry, death, and resurrection. This is how Jesus begins His ministry, that I am opening a pathway back into God's rest. Jesus is restoring the path to enter into God's rest for all of us. Here's the main point, man. True rest is found in Jesus as we trust Him to provide salvation from our broken sinfulness through His sacrificial work on our behalf. This is real rest. This is where all of the Bible's ultimately leading us up to, man. And this is, God enters this rest, and yet because we broke our relation with Him, man, there's morning, the cycle begins again for us. And in this meantime, it's this constant cycle of going back and having to fight for and realign our hearts back to answer the question of who do we trust for our salvation? Who do we trust for our provision? Here's the final evolution of rest, really, in the Bible. We get a little bit more in the book of Revelation, but we don't have quite time for that. Here's how the final evolution of rest takes place. This is Hebrews 4, 1 through 7. Then I'm going to pray and close this out. The writer of Hebrews says, he gets this concept of Sabbath rest. He said, therefore, let us fear if while a promise remains of entering into God's rest, as we're talking about, be afraid if there's an opportunity for you to enter into God's rest, and any one of you may seem to have come short of it, right? You want to be worried about something, don't be worried about what you're going to miss out on because you didn't work enough. Be worried about the rest that you missed out on if that opportunity is available to you. And this is kind of the question that he goes on to explore over the rest of this text. For indeed, we have had a good news preached to us, right? This is what Jesus did. Just as they also, it's talking about people in the Old Testament, but the word they heard did not profit them because it was not united by faith in those who heard. Faith. Who do you trust? Who provides for you? Who gives you ultimate rest? For we who have believed enter that rest, just as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So there's this thing, right? And this is, Passover, looks at this, Day of Atonement, looks at this. Actually, all of the festivals and feasts, all of the ideas of Sabbath and rest and trusting in God and the provision that comes as we do that, right? Like if we fail at rest, then God doesn't allow us to enter into that rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all of his works, right? He's just going back through some stuff we've already covered. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Talked about that. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and this is a truth relevant for today, because there are maybe some people, even in this room, who haven't chosen to enter into God's rest by trusting in Jesus, his work on our behalf, right? He's fixed a day. He again fixes a certain day where we can change that. And what day does he say? It's a day, actually. And he's talking back then, but it's absolutely relevant today. Saying through David, after so long a time, just as been said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Now, I think this leads us to close in this series of rest in a bunch of different ways. I think mainly from today, I think we got to realize, man, our work will never be what it's meant to be apart from real rest that allows us to draw strength as we trust in God, right? Our work will never be what it's meant to be. We'll never see the purpose and the reason in our work if apart from being in God's rest. And I think it forces us to answer this question. Have you come to rest in Jesus regularly and intentionally? Or maybe this is the first time you've ever heard this. Have you ever come to rest in Jesus? You ever trusted in him for salvation and for provision? Or you still working at it yourself? Like trying to be good enough or do enough or just like, I don't know, man, just power through. And that's sort of like the human way. So I'm just going to work. I'm going to make it work. He says, man, I don't know. If you want to have real like prosperity in your work, you want your work to do something to change the world the way that it's meant to, it has to be balanced with real rest. And I mean that in the day-to-day sense, but he also means that in the very eternal sense of God's rest. So maybe you need to do that. Maybe you need to call out to God for the very first time as you ask for forgiveness of all the ways that you've tried to work at this thing in your own right, as you've tried to rule your own life. Maybe for the very first time you need to rest in Jesus this morning. Or maybe you've done that a long time ago and you're like me and you don't approach this subject with regularity or intentionality. And you just expect that rest is going to somehow happen for you. And if you've been around long enough, you know that that's not the case at this point. So something has to change. And we have to go back. Let's go back to Jesus, man. Go back to the gospel and ask him to do something, a work on our behalf that we can't do of our own right. We have to trust in him, his provision, and rest in him that he's going to change something in us that we would begin to move towards this. And then we, with regularity and intentionality, we need to set aside margins and space in our life to begin to move towards real rest. You want to see something that would change our culture, change our city, man. It's a bunch of people who get this. They're inviting people into this, into God's rest, in the here and now and in eternity future. This is the balance that our work must have if it's going to do anything worth anything. So I know that we've been through a lot of material, man. I'm going to leave you guys with some stuff that you're going to work out in your expedition groups over the next tonight, or Thursday if you meet then. Ways that you're going to carry this out practically. Ways that you and your family can begin to work through and create intentional cycles of stopping, remembering, and resting. Realigning our hearts, right? You guys good with that? You guys good with work and rest? Everybody good? Been a good series? I enjoyed it, man. I've enjoyed it. I needed a lot of stuff out of this series. So, man, I thank you guys so much for being here. Let me pray, close this out, and we'll see you guys next week. God, we love you and we praise you. We thank you for the ability to work, put our hands to something that matters at the end of the day. God, we just thank you for your example of rest. I just pray that we would take it seriously. I would take it seriously, God, and I'm sorry for all the ways that I have failed to rest well. God, I trust you, and I trust your provision. I realize that all the good that I have, all the good that we have, is because of you. God, we realign our hearts here. We thank you. Go forward and rest as we prepare for our work this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Awesome. You guys have a good week.